Well, hello and welcome to my YouTube channel. I've been asked to explain exposure bracketing, or what I would call exposure compensation. In a previous video a couple of weeks ago I did around Dalry waterfalls, and I kept talking about using exposure compensation and exposure bracketing. So join me and let me walk you through what I mean by exposure bracketing and how I use exposure bracketing, and then what I do with the images ultimately, and I'll walk you through in Lightroom how to edit those multiple images that you're capturing. Alright, so first of all, what is exposure bracketing? So exposure bracketing is a photographic technique that's used to capture multiple shots of the same scene at different exposure settings. So this can be done manually or it can be done automatically. So what I mean by that is you've got the one scene and you might have a really bright sky and a dark foreground, or a really dark foreground and a really bright sky. And what, even using your filters on your camera, you'll probably struggle to get the balance between the two. So how do you capture and darken the bright sky whilst you want to lighten that dark foreground? So using exposure bracketing, that then allows you to do that. So you would set up, so in the image that you're seeing on the screen just now, that area of -3 and +3 that you can see, that's the exposure bracketing setting area. So what I do is I select my button and then I can turn my wheel, and that allows me to select the range down past -3 or +3. So if I go to the left, that means I'm reducing my exposure, so the image is getting darker. So if I have a really bright sky, I swing to the left and darken my image, and then that way I capture the detail in the sky equally for any kind of bright situation. If I've got a dark foreground, I'll expose to the right and I'll adjust the wheel, and then that way I can get a brighter foreground. And then what you then do is bring those two images together in Lightroom or Photoshop. Or what you can do is, if I put in the range between say +2 and -2, that'll then capture 3 or 4 separate images. You can then use Lightroom to bring those 4 images together. And the way you do that in Lightroom is you use HD, but I'll show you that in a little minute. And then the other tip I've got for you when you're using exposure bracketing is you want to use a tripod, because when you're taking the exact same images at different exposure settings, you want stabilization and you want to make sure it's exactly the same image, so that when you come to edit your images, especially when you're importing them and you're trying to do a panoramic view, the 4 or 5 images that you take at each step of your panoramic image all have to be exactly the same. So they all have to line up, but they'll all be at different exposures, and then the software can work out what it needs to do. So hopefully I haven't confused you. So why don't we switch over to Lightroom and I'll show you what I do and how I blend and merge these images together. Lightroom, what I've got here is I've got all my images. I've got 40 images that I took using the panoramic technique or the exposure bracketing technique that I've just walked you through. And as you can see, there are multiple images of the same image, but if you'll see, the exposures are all different. So you've got a really dark, a nearly dark, you've got a kind of normalish looking exposure, and then you've got a really bright exposure. So what I was talking about earlier was the dark exposure helps your sky, and your light exposure helps your foreground in the highlight areas. So how do I bring all these images together? If I select Lightroom, now we're in Lightroom, if I go into Photo Merge, right, so first of all I need to select them all. So Edit, select all images. Then I go into Photo Merge. Now, because this is a panoramic image, I want to do a HDR panoramic merge. So the computer will go away, it'll do that. And with the magic of editing, I'll show you what it's produced now. Alright, so it's worth keeping auto settings on, because that's quite good at giving you quite a start. So let's press merge, because we're happy with that, and it will come back once it's finished its merge of all those 40 images into that single image. Alright, so there's my image. This is my final image. If I click on develop, that'll take us into the editing panel. Right, so as you can see, the auto settings have done a pretty good job so far. Although there's some really dark areas, the sky's been handled really nice. You could argue this foreground's probably a wee bit too bright and this edge is a wee bit too dark. So all you then need to do is, if you want, you can start changing the settings that Lightroom have used to adjust your image. And again, it's all down to preference. I'm just showing you what happens if you make some slight changes here. Again, the highlights will affect the sky and the brightness. You can up the exposure or reduce the exposure, or if you want to isolate a certain area. So if I reduce the exposure back to where it was, then what I can do is I can take the masking brush. If I do a radial circle, turn that round, pull that over, then I can just lighten up the exposure a little bit, lift the shadows a little bit, just reduce the exposure because it's a wee bit too bright, pull down the blacks, the whites are a wee bit bright. Do I need all those shadows? Let me just see there, that could be quite nice. Right, so that area is nice. This area is a wee bit too bright for me. So what I'll do is I'll get a linear gradient, and then all I'll do here is just pull back the exposure just to balance off the image so that this isn't too bright, because this just kept attracting your eye. And then what I can then do is, what you would probably do is you might want to either increase your vibrance or reduce your vibrance. Again, this is all to taste. It's what you like. You could reduce some of the various sliders. So I'll take down magenta, I'll take down purple, I'll take down aqua. Now, what I'll show you is blues usually go in the water, but you've also got blue in the sky. So what I'll do is I'll just pull back the blues a little bit, and that just gives me that wee bit of an edge on the water. And then select. What I can then do is I can sharpen the image a little bit. So if I go down to masking, hold down the option key, slide over just a tad. So the areas that I can see that are white are the areas that are going to be sharpened the most. So I don't want too much too sharp. And then what I could do is just apply a small vignette, maybe take it to 10, -10, and you think, maybe that centre's not bright enough. So then we go back to masks, get a radial dial. I'm doing this really quick just so that you can see a fast edit, and then just lift the exposure just a bit, pull down the highlights so the highlights take away the glare out the water, give those shadows a wee lift, and if you want you can just give the clarity, not too much, but just lift the clarity just a touch. Again, it's all down to personal taste, it's what you really like. And there we have an image that's been created from those 40 images, and it gives you that one image. Now there's a lot more we can do to this image, but using the HDR merging facility means that we talk about dynamic range. So where you had all the darks and all the highlights, and you had a kind of blend of midtones and all those other images, it brings them together in one, so that you can start to create depth if you want in certain areas. Like the trees in the background, they're pretty dark, so they're pretty light. So what I can do is I can take the brush, I can increase the size of the brush, I can highlight those trees, and then what I might want to then do is just increase the blacks. So if I pull down the blacks just a little bit and darken those trees, what you'll start to see is there's a little bit of depth starting to creep in. I can just lift the highlights out just a touch, push up the whites, and that'll give them a wee bit of a glare. And again, all of these tweaks that you're doing to your image for your personal preference, either adds what you like and gives it some depth, gives it some tone, gives it some colour. Again, it's really up to you how you want to do that. If I want to save the image, I'll go to File, I'll go to Export, and I shall select the folder where I am already and hit Export, and then that'll export that image, that final image, so it'll be quite a sizable image. I'll put that in and I'll show you that at the end of the video. Alright, so that's the export finished. Right. Now what I'll share with you is a single scene with 4 separate images. So as you can see here, we've got a really dark exposure. It's slowly starting to bright up. We've got a kind of mid image, and then we're getting a really bright image because all the highlights in the sky are blowing out and the water's blowing out. So if I go back to photo, and then this time just do photo merge HDR, because we've only got the one image. I'll keep auto align and auto settings selected, and let's wait until this has created the HDR image. Alright, so we've now got our final 4 exposure images merged into one. So if I press develop, and there we have it. So as you can see, it's actually done a pretty good job in its own right. So the auto has not been that bad. And what I'll do is, actually there's not a huge amount I want to do to this, to be fair. I'll just increase texture. I'll give it a wee touch of clarity because that gives me a wee bit of contrast. In the trees, I might just push up the contrast just a bit, just to make the image a wee bit more darker. Then you've got a choice. What format do I want the image in? Do I want to keep the original ratio, or do I want to do 16:9? So if I select the crop tool, select the original, go to 16:9, and then what we do want is that foreground. So if I just clip that top cloud, there we go. So what we can then do is have a wee look at the colour mixer. Right, if I reduce the aqua, take down the purple, take down the magenta, and then apply a little bit of sharpening, and then put in a vignette, and let's see how the vignette works. 8 to 10. It's not too bad. What I want to do is just darken the sky a little touch. So if I go into the masking tools, select the linear gradient, just pull this down a slight touch, and then what I want to do is just slowly pull down the exposure, so it's very, very slight, as you can see. And then what I'll do is I'll add a second linear gradient, and I'll just do a little touch at the top. I'll pull that down again, just enough so that we've got a kind of framing of, we've got a dark top, a darkish bottom, and then we've got the middle. And again, what if you want to lighten the middle of the image up a little bit, we could add a circular radiant filter like so, and again I can slide that over, give the exposure just a little lift, pull down the highlights because of the water, lift the shadows a little bit, and then what we could do is just push up the saturation just a bit, and there we have a final image. So what I'll do is I'll do a file, export, it's going to the same location, export, continue. Once that image is exported, what I'll do is when I've finished, I'll share those 2 images with you and you can see the end result. But hopefully you can see the benefits of using exposure bracketing. So you'll also see it on your camera, an abbreviation called AEB. So when you do your exposure bracketing, it'll come up at the bottom saying Auto AEB, and AEB stands for Auto Exposure Bracketing. And it's just the difference between whether you want to stand there and manually make those exposure adjustments for every single image, or you key in your range for your +3 to your -3, and then that automatically adjusts and takes all the exposure settings for you. Hence why the first image we got 40 different images to use and then merge together. Okay, so hope you enjoy these 2 images. Alright, so I hope you found that really useful. Hopefully you can try it. Don't be afraid. It's actually worth it, because sometimes what you do is, through the multiple exposures that you take, that one image might be the optimal image that you're actually looking for, and by just adjusting down the highlights and adjusting up the shadows, you might end up with a perfect image rather than having to edit 4 or 5 separate images or bringing them together. So look forward to hearing from you to see if it worked for you. If you like the video, please give it a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed, please do, because you know it's free. And if you press the bell notification, that will let you know the next time I post a video. So thanks again for watching, and here's to the next video.